Thank you, Fred, and good evening to all. Well, Fred mentioned the fact that or hinted at the fact that we are living through, let's say, a moment of historical setback, if not a counter-revolutionary moment in the dynamics, the regional dynamics that was inaugurated by the uprisings in 2011, and that's indeed the case in the sense that the one particularity of the region, as I had more than once the occasion to emphasize, including I think in meetings organized by Socialist Resistance, is that this is a region where you had one revolution, but two counter-revolutions, in the sense that you the counter-revolutionary front was itself composed of two competing and even opposed forces. On the one hand, the representatives of the old regimes, so the classical counter-revolution in any revolutionary situation, the old regime represents the counter-revolution usually. But here in this case, in the case of the region, we've had over several decades the development of forces of opposition to the old regime, but from a reactionary standpoint, from a religious fundamentalist standpoint. And these forces were at various moments connected to the stronghold of regional reaction represented by the oil monarchies, the Arab oil monarchies, with shifts in the alliances between one monarchy and the other, and with a kind of split among the monarchies, eventually faced, in the face of the dynamics opened by 2011, into a polarization between the Saudi kingdom, who emerged as the main supporter of the old regime, and the Emirate of Qatar, who had been the main funder of the main force within the Islamic opposition to the old regimes, as represented by the Muslim Brotherhood. And beyond that, you have the whole dynamics of the evolution of the events. And the failure of the progressive forces in the region to build an alternative to both these counter-revolutions have left the scene quite open to this clash between these two counter-revolutionary poles, which is very much part of what I have been calling since 9/11, the clash of barbarisms, which goes even beyond, of course, the regional forces into the international dimension. And what we are witnessing in Syria and Iraq with this rise of IS is very much an illustration of this dialectics between two forms of barbarism, equally reactionary, ultimately. So from the start, one could see in the comeback of the United States massively to the region in 1990-91, the devastating war on Iran, and then the devastating embargo that was imposed on Iraq. You could see this already this clash of barbarism which at work. And the barbarisms of the way the United States destroyed the Iraqi infrastructure and then imposed on that country an embargo of genocidal proportion, which led, the common estimate is that you have close to 1 million people who died as a result of the embargo imposed on Iraq after '91 and until the occupation of that country. And this fed into violent forms of resentment, of which Al-Qaeda, which emerged at that time and as a reaction to the US deployment in the region, Al-Qaeda became the main illustration or the main embodiment for a while of this counter-barbarism, which, as illustrated in 9/11 and in the various actions that happened later on. Now, with the invasion of Iraq, this was taken to much higher dimensions, and we have seen it very much at work in Iraq. The barbarism of the US, British, etc. occupation, Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, the massacre of Fallujah, and all that, and therefore this huge resentment, much even deeper than the one that had been created by the US war on Iraq in '91. And on the other hand, the development of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. As you know, this invasion of Iraq was conducted under the pretext of fighting Al-Qaeda and with the false, the open lie about a connection between the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. This invasion of Iraq is what created the historical opportunity for Al-Qaeda to establish itself as a territorial force in the heart of the region, whereas before then it was in Afghanistan, it was a kind of terrorist underground network globally, but it didn't have the kind of territorial base that it managed to achieve after 2003. And thanks to the US invasion and to the US occupation and the ways and forms of this occupation. So you have this dialectics, if you want, and of course Al-Qaeda is an extremely reactionary product, and that's why, for instance, all those blank support, open, unconditional support to the Iraqi resistance without making any distinction, instead of supporting actions against the United States, the US-British occupation, but making a distinction between them and other actions often waged by the same forces. And I'm speaking here of sectarian killings and sectarian massacres that developed in Iraq. Was a real problem. Now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged powerfully, especially after the massacre of Fallujah and the rest. So after 2004, it peaked in 2006, 2007, but was later defeated when the United States changed its strategy in the region, in Iraq, and resorted to the very classical colonial recipe of buying the tribes, the Sunni tribes in this context, in order to remove the kind of the popular framework within which Al-Qaeda was developing. Ultimately, the United States managed through this tactics, through co-opting the Arab Sunni tribes, and therefore changing even the character from that regard of the occupation with regard to the sectarian balance in Iraq. It managed to relatively marginalize Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, what happened is that the war in Syria, the civil war that developed in Syria after the initial phase of the uprising in that country, recreated, if you want, the kind of conditions into which phenomena like Al-Qaeda can develop. And here we have another illustration of the clash of barbarism, if you want, a local one, with the huge barbarism of the Syrian regime, this absolutely terrible massacre that the regime has been conducting, the destruction of the country. I mean, something unprecedented. I mean, there's nothing in modern history one can think of a government destroying its own country in this way, in a way very much resembling the mutual destruction of opposed countries in international wars, like the Second World War or the rest. This is the kind of scenery that you see from Syria. So this extreme brutality and barbarism of the regime fed again, or created again, the kind of resentment which, or very sharp resentment, which in the absence, of course, of revolutionary, radical, progressive forces and the rest, I'm speaking here of the Arab populations, not the Kurdish population, in the absence of such forces, you could have such extremely violent, fanatical, fundamentalist forces such as Al-Qaeda seizing the opportunity. And ISIS is nothing but Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, moving to Syria in seizing the opportunity created by the conditions there. And that's why what used to be called the Islamic State in Iraq changed its name into the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the famous ISIS that we know before re-changing the name when it went back into Iraq and re-established itself in both countries this time. So, and again, the reasons why it managed to move back to Iraq is related to the sectarian attitude of the Tehran-backed Maliki government in Iraq, which alienated totally those Arab Sunni, the Arab Sunni population that the United States had managed to turn against Al-Qaeda before leaving the country. And this is what created again this possibility for ISIS to get back in Iraq with the development that we have seen. Now, as a background also to all that, we should add the fact that, we can see here how the lack of support to the Syrian mainstream opposition also was instrumental, was absolutely crucial in the development that we are seeing now. And this is something that even, Hillary Clinton, for instance, acknowledged. I'm reading from here an interview she gave last August. I know that the failure to help build up a credible fighting force of the people who were the originators of the protests against Assad. There were Islamists, there were secularists, there was everything in the middle. The failure to do that left a big vacuum which the jihadists have now filled. They were often armed in an indiscriminate way by other forces, and we, the United States, no skin in the game that really enabled us to prevent this indiscriminate arming. Well, what she's saying here is true. This is true. This is the result of the policies of the Obama administration in refusing even to give the Syrian opposition even defensive, the defensive weapons that the Syrian opposition was requesting. That is, you have a government that is destroying its country, massacring its people, and the main weapon in this endeavor is the aviation. And I mean, had the Syrian opposition been equipped or given anti-aircraft and also anti-tank weapons, it could have certainly limited to a large extent the degree of killing and devastation perpetrated by the regime. And the fact that the United States did not support, did not give this opposition these weapons was because the United States has never wished the downfall of the Assad regime. Actually the main concern of the United States was that the Syrian state should not collapse. It should be kept as a state, and there should be some kind of compromise with Assad. Sometimes they would put pressure for him to step down. Other times they would even mute this kind of condition, as we are seeing now. Now the result of all that has been, of course, this breakthrough of IS. And ultimately, when IS moved back from Syria into Iraq, into closer to the oil fields, if you want, then the United States could no longer contemplate the massacre without doing anything. It intervened, but then intervened directly. This is what they are prepared to do. They did in Libya, where they refused to arm the uprising in Libya. They never accepted any of the many requests of the Libyan uprising in 2011 to get weapons, but they wanted to do the job themselves in order to control the situation, in order to be able to steer the uprising into an outcome that suits U.S. interests, and that's the situation which we ended having. Here we are against direct intervention. I mean, generally by imperialist forces, and it is for this very reason that we are for supply of weapons and to the oppositions, because the alternative becomes what you get now. And of course, the kind of intervention of this coalition of reactionary forces led by the United States, and the fact that the main figure of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party thanks NATO warmly and the United States for their intervention is something that is saddening, although one understands perfectly the situation in which they have found themselves with the imminent threat represented on Kobanê by the Islamic State. And again, this is this kind of situation that we had when Benghazi was under imminent threat from the Libyan Gaddafi regime forces, and one could not, just at that moment, because of the city, about the city, one could not reasonably blame the local population for asking for protection and cheering when they got this protection. But the problem is it starts with a protection of a city, and then it carries on, as we can see now, into a full-fledged project of controlling the whole situation. And what the United States is now actively busy preparing is this compromise with the Assad regime without even any longer the request of Assad stepping down. This is what is being cooked, and this will be a terrible blow for the Syrian people, the Syrian uprising, and actually this will play into the hand of IS, as we can see. And now you have this conjunction between the coalition strikes and the Assad regime strikes. Today, just before coming here, read the news of the Syrian regime bombing Raqqa, which is one of the cities under IS control, and killing between 70 and 90 people. And you can be sure that certainly not all of them were IS fighters. So this creates a huge resentment, and this is the problem. The problem is that with such tactics and strategy, imperialism is creating a disastrous situation in the region, which really represents a very huge threat and danger for the future.
Thank you.